Hello, everybody. I'm John Atack, and how extremely pleased I am to welcome my dear friend Mark Laxer today. Hi, Mark. And I'm saying this bit of nonsense at the start recently, which is that we are somewhat expert in our field by now. We have spent many decades crawling around in this material and wondering what on earth happened and what's going on and trying to provide some kind of answers. So we could be considered to be experts, we could be considered to be teachers, but we are part of a community of learning. And as yet, we don't know everything. And we're working towards it. But so if you have any comments, suggestions, questions, anything that will advance our understanding as a community, that would be fantastic. So there you go. There's my preamble. And today, what are we going to talk about today, Mark?
I was thinking about talking about cult education.
I was educated by a cult once.
I think it's a kind of a difficult topic because I think that it's kind of I'm just thinking about this. So if you're teaching people, first of all, the cult leaders are teaching people about things that are potentially unknown and unknowable.
Don Rumsfeld being a significant cult leader, of course.
So John, if you start at that position, it's like, do any of us, including the top scientific minds, those minds I do very much respect, but even those top scientific minds, do they absolutely know the absolute deepest story of our creation, how we came to be, and how does the universe, and is there multiverses, and what is consciousness, and is there a greater force that's guiding this, or is it all sort of a physical universe, and what happened before 13 billion years ago? There's so many unknowns.
And who's paying for the next round?
I wish.
Great mysteries. Great mystery.
I like to know who's buying my drinks, Mr.
Yes,
H.
I think that's it. That's basic, isn't it? But it is true that we are born into mystery, live in mystery, and will die in mystery, really.
Yes, including Rohinton Mystery, wonderful book, A Fine Balance. But seriously, though, it's sort of like the cult leaders, the spiritual leaders, the genuine spiritual leaders, church leaders, mystics, they don't actually know. And when you leave a group that presumably had been, if it's just called a destructive cult, you would assume that there was some amounts of abuse going on. If you leave a group like that and then you look to something, maybe you look to a book, maybe you look to Henry David Thoreau, or you look to a book by John Atack, or you look to a book by Steve Hassan. All good things to do, in my humble opinion. But whomever you look to, maybe you look to Mahatma Gandhi because you gain inspiration from them. Maybe you look to your local rabbi.
Or butcher, the local butcher, possibly.
It was the butcher, grandma. Dun, dun, dun.
That's it. Yeah.
When you leave a group, it's sort of a destructive cult, and you look around and you sort of looking for answers, those people don't, they may be able to teach you to have guardrails and to protect your psyche. That's the sort of thing where a John Atack would be absolutely brilliant at, or a Stephen Hassan, in my opinion. It's like they can teach you to go on whatever path you want, but don't get yourself abused. But those people don't have, or it's not likely that they have the ultimate answers to the universe. So,
well, I do actually, Mark. It's just nobody's given me enough money to want to share them. But
well, so how much money John, do you
How much have you
need?
got? And how much can you borrow beyond that? Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Mm.
So it just seems that it's a difficult thing being a cult educator or whatever it is that you do, and whatever it is that I do. It's sort of difficult in that if we are to be honest, we don't have a clue as to what all these people were originally looking for. So the only thing that we can sincerely and authentically do is point out the potholes and the broken bones and stuff where in the past people have gotten hurt, and just point to that and say, dear friends, as I say on the back cover of one of my books, fly east, fly west, but don't fly into the cuckoo's nest. In other words, go explore. Don't just sit home and lock the doors and start living a sort of a life where you're afraid of everything and that you can't experiment. But be careful, watch your back and have a map. Remember what John Atack had said. If you go join this group or you experiment, remember what John Atack had said, so that if your leader starts doing this and that, you'll have a roadmap with which to get the hell out of there.
Yeah.
And to be honest, John, tell me if I'm wrong, or if you think I'm wrong, that's the best we can do.
But it's good enough because while not claiming to know everything about the universe, one can be a Sherpa and lead somebody to the top of a mountain. And one can say, well, I know how to get to the top of the mountain. And in this case, we are talking about routes and pathways and how people get to places. And what distinguishes the authoritarian leader, the cult leader, from other people is conviction, certainty. They know what's going on. And what we're saying is that intelligence coupled with humility tells us that we don't know everything. It's very unlikely that we will ever know everything. And it doesn't matter whether we know everything or not. What matters is the kind of lives that we lead, the relationships that we have, and what we contribute to society, and how we look after ourselves within society. And within those parameters, we can teach something. So may not be able to teach reliably the ontology, the origin of the universe, and we may not be able to teach the teleology, the end of the universe and how that will come about. Though apparently it's going to get very, very dark before that happens. But we can say that in this valley of tears in which we live, which is not entirely tearful in my experience, the Buddha was a miserable old sod who said everything's suffering, and I don't really believe that. I think there's a great deal of gladness and joy in the world too. But how to manage the suffering and the joy, how to be able to assert ourselves, how to define reasonable goals, and how to keep ourselves out of the clutches of people who mean us no good and who do not have our best interests at heart. Those are things that we can teach about, within that purview. And the first thing is that sense of conviction that when somebody comes along and says, I have the answers to everything, then it's like, no, you've convinced yourself. You have a feeling of certainty, a feeling of knowing about the universe. But you're probably not going to convince me. Many people, on a daily basis, people try to convince me of things. And much of the time I find their arguments unconvincing and self-serving, arguments that are trying to sell me something, basically.
So I hear everything you just said, and
raise you.
I'm going to sell it to the Russian government. No, just kidding. I hear what you're saying, John, and I agree with all that, but there is one mini interesting bit to toss into the mix.
Mini truth, as George Orwell puts it.
It's a mini Orwell. It's an Orwellian mini, or an OM, which is Om. So the bit I wanted to throw in there has to do with, well, I'm referencing it in a novel I'm currently working on, speaking of Orwell, where there are two types of people. And now we're getting into human psychology. In the novel, they're called the Certs and the chaots. And again, this novel is not very far along because I've been working on a film, a screenplay, and I just don't have any time to work on the novel. So such is c'est la vie, such is life. But I have started on this and I've thought a bit about it. And the idea of there being a bifurcation within a society between the two groups. They sort of this is inside the framework of the novel. They were going to go to war, but they decided not to, but they split into two, if you will, nations, the Certs and the chaots. What does it mean, John, to be a Cert? A Cert is, in this context, someone who feels less stressed when they're certain about the world around them. And a chaot has a very different mindset where they're actually, the world is spinning around and they don't know, I don't know what it is, we'll figure it out. And they do not feel anxiety when the world around them is in chaos. Whereas the Cert, actually, and I'm being sincere in talking about this. I mean, it's a novel and I could joke about this, but I believe that in real life, there are, I don't know if it's half the population, but a large percentage of humans feel deep anxiety when they are not certain. And when, you know, like, how did you come to be? I don't know. Well, believe in this. Now I have a framework. My anxiety, it doesn't all disappear.
No.
But it mitigates, the certainty mitigates the deep feeling of angst that permeates someone's soul. So I'm just tagging that along onto what you were just saying. You have some leaders who, I'm just trying to remember what you just said a few minutes ago, because I think it was spot on. You have these leaders who project this certainty. And the other side of that coin is you have 50% or maybe 70% or 38%, some large population of billions of people, billions with a B, who deeply need or want or feel that they need complete and utter certainty. And because of that, they are ripe for being taken advantage of, because unfortunately, the universe we live in has not a huge amount of certainty.
Yeah, and that certainty is very often couched in language. It's very often beliefs that are asserted in words. And when you start digging into those words, you find that the certainty tends to crumble. There's a number that has come up again and again, and I've referred to it frequently. And anybody who's spent time watching videos that I'm in will have heard me talk about this at some point. The number is 60%. And it's a number that was put forward by Schopenhauer, the German philosopher. And he basically put forward the idea that 60% of people haven't actually become people. The idea was picked up by Erich Fromm, and he talks about it in his book about how Nazism came about, Escape from Freedom, published in 1941, where he says the reason that Nazism was successful was because people had a pseudo-self. We then go on to Stanley Milgram, and none of these as far as I know, none of these people references any of the others, which quite interests me, that they all come to about the same number. Stanley Milgram in the early 1960s performed his experiments out of Yale University with the pretend shock machine and the actor who screamed when a pretend shock was administered in his learning experiment. And he found that just over 60% of people were compliant to the extent of being willing to go to the extremely dangerous XXX shock on the machine and shock somebody simply because an experimenter said, it's my responsibility, you just go ahead and push the button. Then more recently, a psychologist called Jane Ferguson, who's at Nottingham University, and I should go and meet her because it's only 6 miles up the road, but I haven't. But she wrote again about this idea that about 60% of people who she calls apaths don't really make decisions. They go along with other people. And the way of looking at this, I like Fromm's way, which is that such people look to the outside for reassurance that they're doing the right thing. You know, that their hat is the right kind of hat that is approved of by society, that they're driving the right car, that they eat the right things in restaurants, that they talk about the right things, that they watch the right television soaps or the right movies, that they dance to the right music. And this is a kind of herd crowd mentality that, and I take it to a very simple place. And this comes from the work of Patricia Crittenden, who wrote a wonderful book called Raising Parents. And she basically says, let's push aside all psychiatric diagnoses. Let's push aside all of the ideas you might have about somebody being, you know, having ADHD or Asperger's or depression or what have you. Let's look at them and say, have they grown up? And I think that fits perfectly into Fromm's idea that the majority of people don't actually grow up. They don't become individuals. And then you have that group of people that Fromm separates out, who he calls malignant narcissists, and which is recognized as the narcissistic personality disorder now. And they make up a small percentage of human beings, but they too have only a pseudo self. And as Fromm points out, they aren't actually narcissists. They don't love themselves. Freud got that wrong. The origin of the word narcissist in psychology is Havelock Ellis before Freud. Ellis was the first of the sexologists in the 19th century, studying sex and trying to understand what happened. And he brought the word narcissist out of Greek mythology, the chap who turns into a daffodil by gazing at himself and his own beauty in the water, in a pond, and said a narcissist is somebody who does not wish to have sex with anyone but him or herself. A narcissist is somebody who masturbates and is sexually self-enclosed. Quite different to Freud's idea of somebody who loves only themselves. And as Fromm points out, narcissists are incapable of love. It's not something they can do. So they want to be loved. They want to be adulated. And what Fromm doesn't connect, and I in the half dozen of his books that I've read, which I think is interesting, is that to say that there are malignant narcissists is to say there are also benign narcissists. There are people who have an incomplete self, who are not nasty in and of themselves. They don't demand adulation, but they are not fully formed. And so this would be to say that those people who demand certainty, who must have certainty, which I think we've agreed is something you can't actually have reasonably in this universe. You can be sure that you brushed your teeth this morning, but when we get to, you know, the beginnings and ends of the universe and the purpose or meaning, possible meaning of the universe, or the hard problem of consciousness, which philosophers talk about, which nobody as yet has come close to solving. What is consciousness? What is going on here? And why is it going on? Those questions we cannot be certain about. So all we can have is the pretense of certainty, the feeling of certainty, and tell the same story.
Or the belief in certainty.
Yeah, but I think it is a feeling. I think, you know, the story I've been retailing for a long time. I was 17, a Bible basher stopped me and preached at me for a couple of hours, and I kept responding because, you know, I don't know how to walk away. Obviously, there's something wrong with me. And he did walk away after 2 hours. And as he backed away from me to make sure I didn't leap on him and tear him to pieces, backed away from me. And he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Now that is the feeling of knowing, the feeling of certainty. And the point is that it's an illusion. So if somebody, a cert, has got to this position, then they need to actually go the next step, which is to accept that we live in a fluid universe where meaning is beyond human perception at the moment. It may be that the Buddha or Jesus or somebody along the way did realize what was going on, but they weren't able to explain it well enough for the rest of us to understand it. So a lot of people grab on, pretend to understand, and then enforce their rules on other people to say, this is how you have to live, because this is what God wants, or this will, you'll achieve nirvana through doing this. And people then follow on that track. And terrible atrocities come about. As Voltaire said, if you believe, those who believe absurdities will commit atrocities. So if you look at the religious side, the teachings that led to witch hunts and the persecution of other faiths, the genocide of the Albigensians by Innocent III, Pope, or the raid, the destruction of Constantinople by Innocent III, or in our own time, Buddhist monks who are in Sri Lanka and Myanmar, who are part of violent militaristic movements to kill people who do not believe as they believe. These are people driven by a sense of certainty that has become righteousness, the dispensing of existence, willing to consider your own life more important than that of other human beings. Those certainties are very dangerous. So to live as a chaot, to live as somebody who accepts that the world is beyond our grasp, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to understand it. It means that we shouldn't have the arrogance, the hubris to believe that we understand it.
Yes, absolutely. I think it's very difficult to create a society where young people are taught to become adults, to move beyond the benign narcissist label or reality that you're sort of outlining in the last few minutes. And the problem with that is that societies generally don't want to do that because the certs are kind of controlling the institutions.
And with obvious, for the most part, the best of intentions, that they really sincerely believe in the rules.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I'm not.
Chaos will come about if they don't. The problem is that it's a fundamental lack of trust in human nature. I don't, there's this great point where, who was it? Carl Rogers asks, the Jewish theologian Martin Buber, and he says to him, I think you'd agree with me, Martin, that man is basically good. And Buber pauses for a moment and says, yes, man is basically good and evil. And I've arrived at that point that there are people on either side of that line saying man is evil, so has to be controlled, has to be contained, has to be prevented and inhibited from letting out the real fundamental nature, which is the shadow self of Jung or the id of Freud, this bestial creature, Mr. Hyde, that they believed lived inside of everybody. They were certs, they believed in this complete nonsense. I don't believe that there's any evil animal living inside me or any other human being. I do believe that evil can be done. So I believe that we have goodness and evil within us. We have the capacity to do good and evil. Some people are very bad. We call them psychopaths. They make up about 2% of our population. A tiny proportion of them are homicidal psychopaths. They kill people. At the other end, you have empaths. You have people who are genuinely good and seek to do good in the world. And then there's the mass of humanity, the remaining kind of 96% of humanity, who are somewhere on a scale of good and evil, depending on what deities, what mood they're in, but also depending on the society in which they have grown up and whether that society has sought to make them responsible, allowed them to mature. And I believe our educational system is an institutionalization. An institutionalization is simply making everybody a child, making everybody obedient, making them follow the rules, not accepting that people's creativity and intelligence may lead them to become good, may lead them to want to contribute to society. And by inhibiting curiosity and inhibiting creativity, two foundations of our educational system in the first, second, and third worlds, we are preventing that surge of creativity and positivity that keeps trying to burst out from the human race. We do keep doing wonderful things as a species alongside the dreadful things we do. So I think maturity and focusing on that and saying, by the time you're 8, when you're born, you can't do anything for yourself. By the time you're 18, you should be able to do all the basic things for yourself. Most especially, you should be able to think for yourself. You should be able to choose and decide for yourself. Our society doesn't encourage that. It wants you to buy the products from the advertisements, and that's about it, to follow the political leaders and have faith in them, although we see that quite a number of them are in fact corrupt, no matter what their party is.
In a sense, it's quite ironic to have parents freaking out that their kid has joined a cult. And they run around as my parents did. And if it happens, with my kids, I'm sure I will do the same thing. But from the bird's eye view, it's really quite silly to have people running around. Oh my gosh, little Irving has joined a cult where the whole society is training people to kind of be in cults.
Exactly. It's enculturing people. Yeah.
And it's taboo to point out that sort of thing. Like, people look at you like you're crazy, because it's almost like you're inside a bubble, and the reason for the bubble is it's unspoken, it's culture, it's our own rules, and it's recursive, and it's all I remember I was talking to the great novelist, writer, some people wouldn't think he's great, but Paul Theroux, and he was saying cult and culture, those two words are very similar. And I think there was quite a bit of insight there when he was saying that. So recently, in as homework for this film I'm creating with a bunch of other people, I've been seeing a lot of films, like the screenplay writers whom I'm working with keep giving me homework. And some of my friends who are helping with this project are giving me homework. So I keep seeing these films. Since last we've spoken, I've seen like 6 or 7 or 8 hours of a Rajneesh, Sri Bhagwan Rajneesh documentary. And I've seen
Wild Country, yeah?
Correct. A brilliant documentary.
Well, as long as you don't care what happened to the rank and file members of the group, because it is only the leaders of the group who are interviewed. You don't get any idea about the violence, the sexual promiscuity.
That I said the same thing to the people I was talking to. It's like it's
beautifully made.
It's a bird's eye view. It's not, you don't see the destruction therein, and that I forget her name, but she was frightening. Sheila, frightening piece of work.
She's fascinating. I'm going to stop at that point because I watched that, and I've watched lots of things about Rajneesh. I used to use a piece called My Dance Is Now Complete, when I did interventions back in the early 1990s. That was a very easy thing to show to Scientologists, to to show them that, that they didn't identify with that group in any way. And they could see that it was a cult, and they could see that it was dangerous. And it was then possible to say, but, they talk about the poodle press, and that's Scientology's attitude toward the media, isn't it? What have you. But so I read a fair amount, and I've read Hugh Milne's The God That Failed, which is, he was Rajneesh's bodyguard and researched his childhood and things like that, wrote a very good book. So Wild Wild Country was fascinating, seeing people who are still all these years later utterly devoted. Marianne Sheila, I think, was sentenced to 8 years in prison. She performed the second largest poisoning in the history of the United States. The first was the smallpox blankets that were given to the first peoples by the second peoples of America.
Excuse me for interrupting, John, but I've never seen such arrogance as I saw in Sheila, and I just thought, and not, I'm sure Rajneesh had his own measure of arrogance, but
let me make the point about Sheila, because it is entirely relevant. I was fascinated at the end of the documentary, and I'm sorry to spoil it for anyone, to find that Marianne Sheila at this time had been running a home for geriatrics with dementia in Switzerland, I believe, for some years, having come out of prison. So she was doing something that was incredibly empathetic, and that fascinated me. So I went and bought her autobiography. And this is a really fascinating book, because in it, it becomes pretty clear. The book's called Don't Kill Him. It becomes very clear. She was 16 when her father gave her to Rajneesh, because he believed that Rajneesh was Bhagwan, the supreme god, as he calls himself. And so he gave his 16-year-old child to this dreadful human being. She then became the agent. But what becomes, I think, very clear within the book is that she only did what he told her to do. She acted on his orders. She is evidently an empathetic person. We see how she spent her life since. She's doing something that is gruelingly difficult, looking after old people who have dementia. I mean, I couldn't do it. I'll be honest. I'm relatively empathetic, but I would find it really difficult. I did look after my mother until she died at the age of 94, but she did not suffer any loss of her faculties. And having been around people with Alzheimer's or vascular dementia, I would find it really difficult to do that. She has done this for years. And what comes out of the book is that she is what I call a weaponized empath. She is a thoroughly decent human being who did evil on behalf of a man whom she still is absolutely devoted to. And as far as frauds go, Rajneesh is one of the easier ones to expose. It's not difficult. He was not a super mind. And there are two passages in this book where she just lifts them from Rajneesh's own books and reprints them. And I looked at these passages and went, these are strangely familiar. These are mistellings of the stories of Paul Reps from Zen Flesh, Zen Bones.
Zen Bones, yeah.
The book that got me interested in Zen Buddhism when I was 17. And I went and pulled out my copy of Reps, found both of the stories, and sure enough, Rajneesh has seriously misremembered these stories. So he tells a story about a man who he says becomes a great Zen master because he is with a teacher who every minute of the day hits him with a stick, whatever he's doing. And I'm going, no, he didn't become a Zen master. He became a sword master. Nobody could hit him. Yeah. And sure enough, so he's just somebody like Hubbard and so many others who just grabs hold of the bits he remembers of some story and tells it as if it was his own, or it's some revelation that belongs to him. Rajneesh is a fraud. What's fascinating, and she says, yeah, he was taking huge amounts of diazepam or Valium. He was snorting nitrous oxide for a couple of hours a day. Yeah. Rajneesh, which Hugh Milne, his bodyguard, also says, though the quantity of diazepam differs. Hugh Milne says 50 milligrams a day, which is about 10 times the normal dose. And she says 340 milligrams a day. But whichever way, this man was a junkie, and she knows it. And then she blames other people for inflicting the drugs upon him and says, he really was God incarnate. Don't kill him. So right. I put all of that in because I find her utterly fascinating.
I think she is fascinating. And I feel like she was seduced by the power, the raw power that she had over
16.
She's 16 years old. So I was just struck in that documentary by how certain she was. She was yes. She was one tough cookie. She was so certain she was willing to poison people and
hundreds of people putting salmonella into salad bars so that people would be too ill to vote, so they'd be able to take over the county. They nearly did.
She got quite frightening to my way of thinking. But if she couldn't pull back, God bless her. That's great. But anyway, so I saw the Rajneesh documentary. I've seen Eat, Pray, Love. This is all my homework.
The Vow and Seduced.
I haven't seen those yet. I'll have to see those. But I saw one.
And Holy Hell.
I saw something called Holy Smoke.
Well, Holy Hell is an internal account. The other one I'd add is Kumare. I absolutely, that is one of my favorite documentaries ever, Kumare. So there you go. That's I've just added to your homework. I'm so sorry.
Well, no, that's fine. I will definitely see those. I saw one called Holy Smoke.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
I don't remember it. I may have done over the years, but I don't remember it. Tell us about it.
It's got Kate Winslet. It has Kate Winslet in it.
Oh, it's a movie that I think Rick Ross worked on it. And
very difficult film.
Is there a point in it where she wets herself? That's the thing I remember in Holy Smoke. There's a point where she pees the leg while she's walking along or something. It's a very strange shot.
Yeah, well, it's a sort of thing where
it's about deprogramming. Yeah.
It's about her being kidnapped and deprogrammed, and the person conducting the deprogramming was just an absolute
Harvey Keitel.
Yeah. It just
no, I've never heard of it, and I've not seen it. What can I say?
Yeah, it was sort of the blind leading the
yeah.
blind.
It seems to have nothing to do with what actually happens in the procedure of trying to help somebody.
Correct. Correct. Whoever directed that or wrote that screenplay, they were dreaming up of some fantasy that's very, very dark. And I think that film has actually probably done quite a bit of disservice to people who in the real world get hurt and other people help them. Yeah. But in either case, what I found about that movie was this is one thing that I thought made sense in the film that pertains to what you and I were talking about earlier. And that is, it's really, people join cults because that's the way our society is set up.
We join groups.
So just looking at in the movie Holy Smoke, if you were to look at that family dynamic and the way it was set up, it just sort of made sense that she would want to find an alternate father, and just the way her dad treated her, but everyone was completely surprised. And I think that's sort of a metaphor for society. Now, that's not to the cult. Their father or mother are not loving or connected. That's not the case. But what I will say is that our society our societies are unwilling to address early life education to protect people from cults because we're mostly certs and we're all kind of cults already. So we won't do that. And we then act surprised, like in the movie Holy Smoke, where the mother and the father, like, oh, our little darling has joined this group in India. in that case, it's over in Australia,
Mm.
but our countries, England, the United States, Australia, we are not doing anything to help develop people to learn about destructive groups, because the line between the churches and the this and the that and the destructive cult are very thin.
Yeah, authoritarianism is an aspect of the society. As far as I know, what you say is true of Australia, and it is true of the United States, but it is not true in the United Kingdom anymore. For quite some years, we've had a program of teaching within our schools, in all of our schools, which is to do with how to be a responsible citizen. And those programs are becoming, I mean, I'm actually working on a set of them at the moment, so I know that there is an initiative at the moment in the United Kingdom, in this very room, to create a syllabus which we have every reason, which will extend an existing syllabus. You know, there are attempts to do this already, but the outline for that does exist within our educational system, you know, handed down from our government some years ago, to say kids have got to be taught personal, social, health, and economic rules, and, you know, citizenship and how to do this. Those programs at the moment are, some of them are very well developed, like programs on bullying, for example. But I'm right, and I've also been approached by a leading school, let me put it that way, with the possibility of developing a specific curriculum for them to help their kids recognize these things in the world. So I think we're on the cusp of change. I mean, this is something I've worked towards for the last decade, and I'm just beginning to see, you know, a way into the system. And there's something that, this the culting culture. My partner's dad used to teach teachers. He taught English teachers in a university setting, and last night he told me this story about when he himself was a teacher, and he said that they'd had a book, and in it they had got different nations, and he was teaching sort of 9-year-olds or something, and they got material about Turkey, and he asked the kids afterwards to say what Turks were like, and they said they're like this, this, and this. And when he said, and what are we like? What are English people like? Oh no, you can't confine us in the same way. You can't say that we all wear fezzes and we all do this. We have all sorts of differences. And he'd recognized this thing that I too see, which is our culture is normalcy. This is the right way to do things. And the first time that was shaken for me, I was about 20 years old, and I read a book called The Silence, which has subsequently been made into a film. And the book is by a Japanese novelist called Shusaku Endo, and he is writing about the persecution of Christians in Japan. Of course, the penalty for being a Christian at the end of the 17th century onwards in Japan was to be crucified. If you were found with any Christian artifacts, you'd be crucified. That was considered a fair punishment in Japan at the time. And what surprised me in reading this book, and I read Yukio Mishima and a variety of other Japanese novels and texts around this time, very interested in Japanese culture. What surprised me was that this man, Endo, who is himself a Christian, writing about Christians in the 17th century, wrote from the cultural perspective of a Japanese person. So there were things that were not recognizable to me as somebody brought up a Christian in England that belonged to that culture. And seeing that there is tremendous diversity within any culture, but we do tend to see all other cultures as cults, as, yeah, their beliefs are irrational, mine are rational, because I grew up in this. I feel that these beliefs are right. And part of maturity is when you start to question your own beliefs and say, yeah, I was brought up to believe that I should love everyone because somewhere in the Gospels it says that I should do that. love my neighbor as myself, and love my enemy. And I found it very hard to challenge that idea. I did it, and I can remember it very vividly. It was in July 1991, because I'd gone out on the first formal intervention I did. And it proved to be incredibly scary, because we were harassed by 7 carloads of Scientologists who, during the 4 days that we did the intervention, didn't actually find who we were talking to. But they did find us, and they did follow us, and tried to get the police to arrest us, and sent us flowers at the end, which we had a bomb disposal guy happened to have tagged himself on our team. So we had a very high level of anxiety. And I came away from that suddenly questioning the unquestionable assumptions of my own life. The central one of which was this notion that I ought to love everybody, even though I had walked away from Christian belief at the age of 13. I'm now, 36 years old by this time, but I've still got this ingrained idea. You got to be nice to everyone. You got to love everyone. You got to do. And I had to think that through. That's something that bound me into my culture that was unthinking. It was not unknowable in Don Rumsfeld's terms, but it was unthinking. And I think maturity is a point where you are able to think without getting too frightened about what you believe, what other people believe, that it's okay for other people to believe different things. I deal with people of all sorts of beliefs, and it annoys the hell out of them that I don't care what they believe. I don't care if people believe in God or don't believe in God. It doesn't even seem important to me. And that really annoys some people, because this is the most important thing to them, that they're an atheist, or they're a theist, or they're a Buddhist, or they're what have you. I'm an agnostic. I don't have any idea about, where the Big Bang, who had the Big Bang. That's the way I like to think about it. Or whether there's a steady state, whether the universe is eternal, or whether there are multiple universes. It doesn't really bother me. It used to, but I think what you're talking about, it's a profound point. The acceptance of chaos, the acceptance of cognitive dissonance, the acceptance that events in the world don't make sense. The loving God wouldn't give 5-year-olds terminal cancer. Well, the world's a bit more complicated than that. And what's going on in the world is a bit more complicated than that. And I'm happy to live with the chaos. So I'm definitely one of your chaots. Because I can't see that there's any way of, certainty to me leads to authoritarianism. It leads to deciding that somebody has more capability. As a kid, I believed this, that the authorities on subjects, the political leaders, they were people who knew about things. Now I know they're idiots for the most part. When you look at the political leaders of the world, and you've written a book about one of them, people like Duterte, Bolsonaro, Modi, Abe, Xi, Putin, Scott Morrison down in Australia, Boris Johnson in this country, and I'm afraid I'm not particularly persuaded by Joe Biden either, or Justin Trudeau. That putting faith in these people when they seem capable of making such incredibly stupid decisions. With our Prime Minister, it's that having ordered everybody that they couldn't meet up, he's had 16 parties during that time. And we now have an inquiry. With Joe Biden, the idea of pulling troops out of Afghanistan and thinking that somehow things would work out. I didn't think they should go in there in the first place, but as with Iraq. But once you've gone there, you have a responsibility. And to give that country back to the Taliban, which was, I felt, inevitable, and what I said would happen on the day that the invasion was announced back in 2001. You have to eventually negotiate. You have to come to agreements. We have political leaders who believe that by brute force, they can achieve good ends. That has never happened in my experience. Brute force, and aggression don't lead to calm and quiet and pro-social societies. Yeah. So we live in a place that is governed by authoritarian beliefs and by this idea that there are these super beings who should be allowed to tell us what to do. And 60% of the people go along with that. And they believe in the authority without kind of going, no, these people they're human beings. They're fallible. They're restricted. They often don't take the right advice, and they often don't apologize for the dreadful things they've done. Barack Obama should have given the Peace Prize back. He knew he was going to send 30,000 troops to Afghanistan the next week. And you shouldn't be getting a big amount of money for being a peaceful person when you're deploying 30,000 troops. It's an irony beyond ironies. So we need to change the perception within society. It's not, for me, so much an education about cults, which is not something I've really thought about for years. Even though I talk about cults a lot, for me, that's just a little part of culture. It's been culture for me, certainly for the last 25 years, that's important, because within a culture, we are permitted to commit atrocities because of the beliefs of our culture. So we can go and kill people in a foreign country, and we're not called homicidal psychopaths because we killed these people. We're called heroes and given medals because we killed these people.
Yeah,
and
I think, yeah, I think that one way that younger and older people can get an education about cults is to travel, because you're moving outside of your culture.
Broadens the mind.
Exactly. So you're seeing the other. I remember I'm Jewish, so I.
Oh, now you tell me. I don't think I can talk to you anymore, Mark. No.
So where were you, John? Where did you go?
That's so.
The screen went dark. It's so dark in here. I found it fascinating back in 2001. I went to Indonesia for the first time, the world's largest Muslim population, as a Jew, and hospitable and how wonderful and friendly. Yeah, I'm sure there's like 0.0 whatever or 1% of the population who has, as any population has whatever dangerous people. But for the most part, I would travel and people would invite me into their homes and here, stay here, let us feed you. I mean, I travel around the United States. No one's ever done that to me. I mean, people can be hospitable here, but and then that was a real eye opener to go to the other, and everyone's like, oh my God, you're going to Indonesia. But what a beautiful place and beautiful people. And I think sometimes travel is the best way to get out of oneself, especially for more than a week. And especially if you get out of your bubble, like go and stay in a kind of place you normally wouldn't stay in, or, try to have a little mini Peace Corps experience, or just get out of yourself, because you can travel and you'd still be protected and surrounded by whatever trapping, so everything looks like at home.
Yeah, well, you still got the Hilton Hotel and the McDonald's and the beach
and so on. And you're
that's
watching.
Not really traveling, is it? That's
right. And at night you're watching whatever, the Disney Channel or whatever it is that you're watching, whatever that.
But of course, in Indonesia they're watching the Disney Channel too. So that is a universal experience, of course.
Yes, well, Disney is God, isn't it? No, I'm just.
Well, we all live in Disney World, don't we? Let's face it.
But
so, is it the red pill or the blue pill that puts us into Disney World? I can't remember.
It's interesting you say that, John, because it kind of if you take everything we've been talking about and try to boil it down, I think what we've been talking about are stories.
Yes, narrative
stories, and how those stories play out across generations, across tribes, and how the stories we tell ourselves define us and hold us inside of bubbles or groups or so on. And when you travel, you're sort of doing what Jesus has said. You're going to the other. I mean, or you love the other. you experience the other. And ultimately that to me is one of the many beautiful things about Christianity, in its what I would think of as in its more pure form, before it's filtered through all these, people who are trying to convince others or trying to rise to power
collect money.
Or collect money or whatever it is. And many of these people are quite wonderful. But if you just take the hundreds of millions of people's filters and just go back to what the man was talking about, this young Jewish guy, and that was to...
Jewish? That's him and you, both of you.
Yeah, we're in the same bubble. So if you look at what look to the other, and that's ultimately what travel is about. And if we were to have our young people in our societies go and find, I think Gandhi was saying this, like go find someone you hate or something and go live with them and shine their shoes or whatever. Go to the other and study it, observe it. Like for me, that was going to Indonesia, and I found that the other was me. My closest friends are devout fundamentalist Muslims living in Lombok, which is one of 17,000 islands over there. I didn't become them, but I tried on their clothes, their burqas, and I found how beautiful it was. And I think in terms of cult education, I think maybe by encouraging our young people to read books and to try on different frameworks, try on different narratives, try on different stories, and not be so certain about one little one that someone's getting a lot of power if you believe in it, that maybe could help open things up. The problem with that is I'm more of a chaot, and that's more of a chaotic point of view where you have a lot of different influences. But that's how I try to raise my kids. And a lot of people are not comfortable with that, probably because that's how they were raised.
Yeah, and it is so variable. I agree with you. Travel broadens the mind. My father traveled very broadly and very widely. He was an export sales manager for a variety of companies throughout my childhood. So he traveled to Africa, spent quite a lot of time in Nigeria and Kenya. He spent a lot of time in the Arab countries. He was very fond of Lebanon and was heartbroken when the civil war broke out there. He spent time in Egypt. He spent time in Israel. He loved Russia. And at the end of his life, he learned Russian. He, by that time, had 8 languages that he spoke. So his attitude, I mean, he served throughout World War II. He signed up at the beginning and he was 7 years in the army. And after the war, he was in Germany and desperately trying to find blankets and food for the German people, which I always rather admired about him, having seen Belsen. He was in the liberating force at Belsen, having been at Dunkirk and at the Normandy landings.
Wow.
Nonetheless, he wanted to do something for the German people. He never took the vicious attitude towards them that many people did take. I mean, it's reckoned that something like 7 million people died in the Russian sector in the 2 years after the war. 2 million died in the Western sector. Many of them, however, from starvation or hypothermia. But horrible things happened. My father did not take part in that, and he never took on that attitude. Whenever anybody asked him what his religion was, he said he was Jewish, which wasn't in fact true. He was an Anglican Christian. But he would say it because he felt that when somebody was asking you that question, you should, at that point, say, look what's happened to this group because of a religious preference. And he, in fact, privately told me towards the end of his life that he was a primitive Jew that he did not believe in the resurrection, but he did believe in God. So he didn't believe in afterlife, but he did. But so he'd come to his own determination. But because he had traveled, because he had seen so much, when the Nigerian people decided they were going to massacre the Igbo, he was traumatized by this thought, by that he'd been in this country, he'd met Igbo people, and the idea of this hatred was, he was not a particularly articulate man. He didn't talk to me about these things. They were expressions of emotion that one saw. But by knowing the other, by finding out that it's a fundamental aspect of Islam that you should be hospitable, and that's certainly something he found in the Arab countries, something you found in Indonesia, and not having this sense that it's this kind of dichotomy that Jung and Freud and so many people in religion, and I keep complaining about this recently, it's an aspect of many psychological systems. You've got this unconscious mind inside you and it's plotting against you. No, you haven't. There's just you in there. There are all sorts of unconscious processes. There are all sorts of ideas that haven't you've only kind of half registered. Like I sent an email to my partner this week, and 15 minutes later I realized I hadn't put the attachment on it. Now, I knew when I sent it that I hadn't put the attachment on it, because I couldn't have known that 15 minutes later. That's an unconscious process, but it doesn't mean that there was somebody in there going, ha, 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 I stopped him from attaching that to the email. And this dualistic view of goodness and evil, that if you believe something that I don't believe, a couple of my friends are theologians. I don't believe in that stuff. But as a metaphor for our existence, it delights me. The idea of God, this is a wonderful idea. I've been what Hindus call an impersonalist for many years, since I was a teenager, because I don't believe in a personified force, a personified intelligence that directs or creates the universe. But I don't really have a clue where the universe came from. And the idea of hurting somebody else because they have a different belief to me about that just seems to me childish. It seems immature to not be able to say, yeah, well, you believe what you believe. That's great. Explain it to me. Tell me your narratives. Tell me the stories that make up your beliefs and why you behave that way. And I'm with Joseph Campbell. I say this repeatedly, that mythology is not history. It's psychology. It's all sorts of other things too, but essentially it's psychology, which is why Freud, of course, went to the Greek myths and plundered them for his Oedipus and Electra complexes and things like this, because these are patterns of behavior. It's why narcissism comes from Narcissus in the Greek myths. We take a story and we say, well, this identifies a certain human behavior. And among those behaviors are dogmatic bigotry, where somebody is incapable of accepting that anybody should believe anything but what they believe. And by travel, by meeting other cultures, by realizing how rich and diverse human thought is, by going and reading Baruch Spinoza, for example, or somebody who's really thought deeply about all of this stuff, David Hume, John Stuart Mill. There have been, Plato as he reports Socrates, as opposed to Plato and what he has to say, which I've not been as keen on, but some of the things that Socrates put forward are remarkably useful, particularly in the sense of where Socrates says, he who knows he knows nothing. He who knows he knows nothing really knows. Lao Tzu, the Chinese philosopher, says exactly the same thing around the same time. And we, to understand, to have some humility and to understand that we're either there are only two paths. One of them is that we're going to destroy the human race out of the hatred that we feel towards other people. And the other is that the human race will persist and become pro-planet, ecocentric. That's the word I like. I don't know if I came up with it. I've not heard anybody else. But to look at the environment and say, the human race could actually be the most positive thing on the planet, rather than being. I had somebody who in the comments said that she was surprised that I had the idea it would be a bad thing if the human race was wiped out. and that whales are much nicer and much better. And we had a little bit of
John, that's just a load of blubber.
Yeah, well, she then quoted "So long and thanks for all the fish," and I pointed out that Douglas Adams was not a whale, and that whales, as yet, despite their tremendous abilities and the kind of rapist nature of dolphins, let's not be too Beatrix Potter about animals here, anthropocentric, that we've made stuff that no other creature can make. And as the Prophet Muhammad said, a man can be as bad as a beast or as good as an angel. And we have that capacity, and we need to evolve into that. And we either are going to wipe ourselves and quite a lot of other things out, or we're going to lean toward the light. As the Sir Gawain and the Green Knight says, we're going to act as if what we did would make a difference, as William James, the psychologist, said, and seek to achieve something positive from our being, each and every one of us, and seek to understand that each and every one of us is a part of what's going on, and what we do and say and think matters. What anybody does and says and thinks matters. And joining into society and making something good and useful of it does mean, as Aya Berlin said, being intolerant of only one thing, and that is intolerance. That the one thing we cannot tolerate is intolerance.
Exactly, which is why I would suggest that we don't ban books, we don't ban other narratives, as we're seeing in some of our southern
cancel culture,
states here in the United States. And it seems to me that the way through all this, as we were saying earlier, is to travel, whether that's physically or mentally. And as one great travel writer once put it, again, I think that was Paul Theroux, the road is good. The road is still good. The road beckons. The road beckons the young minds and the old minds. I'm sort of trying to channel Walt Whitman here. And I think that's probably, it's maybe a chaot view of the world, but that's who I am. And I think in terms of cult education, if someone is trying to heal or understand what, where they should go, or what they should be, recommend to them that they take a few months and travel.
Yeah. And you know, as you say, read about such things. Bruce Chatwin's books are very interesting. And, you know, The Songlines is a fascinating book, which
in Patagonia as well. In
Patagonia, which is, you know, his first book, or Where the Green Ants Dream, which is the film version, accidentally, of The Songlines that his best friend was making while he was writing the book. But to look at other cultures through film, through documentary, I'm tremendously inspired by film about, say, the Kogi people in Colombia, or the Ba'aka Pygmy in the Congo area, or the San of the Kalahari, that these people have very different cultures. Reading the sociologist Eli Sagan, The Birth of Tyranny, is a remarkable book. The Honey and the Hemlock, where he talks about democracy, his book about the French Revolution, where you find out how cultures come to believe something. Or say the work of Raymond Williams, who was a professor at Cambridge here, who took apart the word culture. He started at the beginning of what he came back from World War II and said culture doesn't mean just one thing. You know, we are cultured. The Japanese have a culture. These two use. He then wrote a wonderful book called Keywords, which again my partner's father recommended to me, and which I'm about 70 pages into at the moment, where he takes 60 words and shows how their meanings have changed. And that in fact we often have several meanings running alongside each other. So I hadn't thought the extent to which the word common is the root of so many words like community and communication. They both begin with the word common. And so we find that even the meanings, the foreign meanings, if you will, become important, understanding that the world is a many splendid place with full of ideas and full of beautiful human achievements. And the most beautiful of human achievements is a good community, I believe, as great as any wonderful cathedral or skyscraper, where a group of people have come together and acted effectively and in a loving way towards one another. And this has happened. You know, for 700 years, we had the Indus Valley civilization in West India, which did not have warfare. It also appeared, it didn't have any temples. It doesn't appear to have had any kings. So something, and Raymond Williams would examine the word democracy here and what we might mean by it, because it seems to mean very different things to different people. But they seem to have had an equal society, showing that a non-authoritarian society is possible. You know, that we don't have to be ruled by warlords. And
right, right. And hopefully such blips in history can occur without the Certs coming and killing everybody.
And one thing I am certain of is that we need to embrace chaos. Jordan Peterson, let's just wind up here by saying something horrible about Jordan Peterson. That time of day, I picked up his 12 Rules of Life, which is such a parade of arrant nonsense. It really is. And one of his first assertions is, it is traditionally believed that order is male, masculine. I'm going, which tradition believes that, having read a great deal about the traditions of the world, because I'm fascinated by religions and beliefs, and I've been reading about it since I was a teenager. So I've literally read hundreds of books about various cultures, you know, including a dozen of Joseph Campbell's books and a handful of two handfuls full of Mircea Eliade's books. And so we have this idea that it is a traditional belief that order is masculine, so therefore this chaos is feminine, according to him. And I waited, and 3 pages later, he tells us about the yin yang. And you say, oh, this is a really deep student of Chinese philosophy. He's calling the Dai Chi the yin yang, as hippies and New Age people do. And the idea that the Dai Chi is showing that it's got order at one end and chaos at the other. And you're going, no, it's got red at one and black at the other. It's often shown as black and white these days, but red and black, they don't represent order and chaos. You can see they're both completely ordered. They're the shape of tadpoles. Each has a little eye in it, which shows that the other quality can emerge in it and that things are changing. And this man has become utterly confused about a simplistic explanation of Chinese philosophy. In this case, I'm going to assert, I've read about 120 books about Chinese philosophy, and I don't know what he's talking about. I do know that he's not talking out of the part of his body that one should talk out of, though. He then goes on to tell us, rule number 8 is that you never lie. So those people that kept Anne Frank and those people that smuggled Jews out of Nazi Europe shouldn't have done it, because you mustn't lie. So when you should go to the Gestapo and say, I'm very sorry, we've been keeping this Jewish person. Never lie. What a ridiculous idea. But the man's a buffoon. So I'm happy to have, and we're not in an evolutionary way related to lobsters particularly either, which he seems to think, you know, this idea of a layered brain that's got an old bit that's a crocodile and a new bit that's a mammal and then a human bit, and ne'er the 3 shall meet. You know, that's where it came from, but it's not necessarily an eternal situation in the human brain. It's not a very good way to look at how we are, to think that we're programmed to act like crocodiles and horses, you know, because I don't think we are. I think we have this thing called reasoning. And that if only Jordan Peterson could get some of it, you know, that maybe his cult would dissolve. The millions of people who at the moment believe in this rather thin set of ideas, you know, the cult would dissipate. And add something to that, because that's not a good end point. Say something brilliant, Mark. Go on.
Well, I think that I don't know if this is the proper metaphor. Speaking of
I love proper
crocodiles,
metaphors.
yeah. So let's see if we can find some meaning in this. So the first time I was in Indonesia, I got in the water as I was traveling with a scientist, a biologist, and later found out that that was crocodile infested water. So I still say that the road is good despite people think that to leave your own world and jump in the water is dangerous. And I guess sometimes it can be dangerous, but I would put forth the idea that it's better to experiment. I would rather err in my world and experiment and not ban ideas and not ban books. In a sense, yes, I did join a cult at some point. I joined a different bubble and I learned a lot from it.
Yeah.
I think I traveled to a different place. And I think that I do like the idea of teaching people not to have to get stuck in one particular place that you travel to. So I'm not one of these cult educators, quote unquote, who say, don't explore, just sort of be safe and lock your doors. I do believe in having a roadmap and saying, oh, well, if you jump in these waters here, there may be a crocodile. I wish I had known before I'd gotten in that water that there were crocodiles there. They're 20 feet long. I was much shorter. But I'm glad to have traveled there. And I think it's our role as educators, if that's what we are, to give roadmaps, to provide roadmaps to certs and chaots and say, if you travel here, there may be some danger bits. This is what the danger looks like. If you want to extricate yourself from that bubble, from that mountain, from that language, from that culture, this is how people tend to do that. But I would not want to have a society where you have these big protective plastic bubbles around you to protect yourself, because I just think the world's such an exciting place. I think that's part of being human, is to explore books. And you're reading this book and you don't like chapter 2 and chapter 8, but maybe you'll find some wisdom in chapter 6, or maybe not. Maybe this guy's a total buffoon. But I celebrate the fact that you read a lot, and I think you dip into different ideas and different sciences. I mean, some of this stuff I don't always agree with what you say, but mostly I'm fascinated that you're so well read and you'd like to tie things together. I would hope that our societies suggest that people do more of that sort of thing. Go explore. The road is still good.
And explore. It's a matter of, you don't want to, you want to understand that crocodiles are quite dangerous. And if one of the locals, always talk to the locals and see what they think about the waters and whether they're safe. And if there's a little red sign up and that says don't go in the water, shark infested, that could be sensible. But to restrict yourself, to lock yourself in your own little room and never go out, and it reminds me of my friend Arthur Bookman. He spent 12 years locked in a room on his own, with no human contact, within a group that said that was what would lead him to enlightenment. It didn't. It just meant 12 years of sitting in a room. He's a lovely bloke, though, cheerful, wonderful bloke. But to have a diversity of experience, to not restrict yourself to a diet of McDonald's, and to get something of other cultures and other beliefs, and not get too serious about it, to retain a sense of humor. When you find yourself becoming too serious about it, you're in a cult. And things could get awful. So I think this has been good fun, as it always is. And I hope that those who have struggled through to the end of this route have achieved enlightenment. But it seemed unlikely to me. So we would be very grateful, because we're a community of educators. We're all of us educators. Everybody who has a piece of information can share it. So please do share this information if you think it worthy, an amusing narrative, and ask us questions and make comments and that sort of stuff. Very, very happy to hear that. And correct me when I'm wrong, because I am told that happens from time to time. So thank you very much, Mark. It's been a wonderful experience, and we will do it again. Thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.
How much money, John, do you
How much
need?
have you got?